For 40 years, secret terrorist organizations, many trained by Western intelligence agencies, have manipulated the political control of European sovereign states by a campaign of terror and murder. Originally part of a secret network, these groups changed from being defenders of state security into attackers of the established political order. Until 2 years ago, that secret network was generally known by the single word, Gladio.
One night, a man shows up at your door, no letterhead, no paperwork, just a question. Do you want a confidential mission? He doesn't explain much, because you can still say no, and because the whole thing is built on a single rule. Nobody knows anything they don't need to know. The organization is sealed tighter than a vault. Radios, safe houses, drop zones, a base outside London, another near Boston. The Americans, the British, the French, the Belgians, same program, different flags. They call it Stay Behind. In practice, it's rehearsals for a war that hasn't started yet. Specialists flown in from France, Belgium, England, parachuted at night, met on the ground by men already trained, signaled in, guided into safe houses. An invisible army, not designed to face an outside invader in open battle, but trained to operate inside a country, against what the military world keeps labeling the fifth column. In plain language, the Communist Party and the far left. Anyone suspected of being the internal door the Soviets would walk through. In public, it's never supposed to exist. In private, it's treated like the most basic fact of Cold War life. The Stalinist period is brutal. Western Europe fears invasion. Resistance networks are built in advance. The logic is simple. If the worst happens, if the Soviets roll in, or if a Communist Party takes power, there are people already planted in place. They know where the armchairs are. They know how to use the radios. They can report back what's happening, tip off their handlers, keep a backbone alive until bigger forces arrive. And then, in November 1990, the word leaks into the daylight. Gladio. A Belgian defense minister gets blindsided by questions from Italy, where a scandal has exploded proof of a secret network. A Belgian official is asked directly by an Italian delegate, "Do you know what Gladio is?" He doesn't. He's just seen the headlines on the train between Luxembourg and Brussels. That's how this thing surfaces, not with an official announcement, but like a body floating up in a river. The next shock is older, uglier, the protective instinct around the secret. There's a story from Italy that keeps repeating because it says everything. Aldo Moro is asked, under oath, whether he knows about a parallel, secret structure inside the services. Moro does what men do when they know the rules. He asks the services what he should say. The services tell him flatly that nothing exists. Moro follows the script, "I'm informed," and then the door closes. Denial is not a side effect here. It's the operating system. That's the line that runs through all of it. Parallel structures, parallel loyalties, parallel truth. They say defense. But what they prepare for isn't only Soviet tanks, it's elections, strikes, unrest, public order, the fear of internal takeover. The Cold War, in their language, doesn't end in 1945. It begins. Someone even says it out loud. The Second World War ends and the Third begins immediately, an anti-communist war, fought quietly, inside Allied democracies, using whatever personnel is available, including people you'd never put in a recruitment poster. Right-wing militants, neo-fascists, men with blood on their pasts, cleaned up, recycled, Nazi today, Democrat tomorrow, like changing undershirts. A former SS network in Germany. Arms caches, rifles, grenades, small arms, hidden and ready. An informant opens an album of wartime photos, and there's Hitler. There are high-ranking SS figures, and the message is clear. One phone call, and he can reach hundreds of former SS leaders from Hamburg to Munich. You report it. You expect a promotion. Instead, you're told to keep quiet. They call it necessity. They call it anti-communism. They call it survival. And because it's built to be deniable, it's built to be outsourced. A special amendment to NATO-related protocols, absolutely necessary. You don't even get in the door unless you sign. The essence of it is poison. Governments agreeing not to prosecute right-wing activists for anti-communist activity in their own countries. The logic follows from that like a shadow. If you recruit the right, you can use them. If you use them, you can hide behind them. In Belgium, the architecture is explained like a diagram on a chalkboard. The British intelligence chief, Menzies, connects with Belgium's foreign minister, Paul-Henri Spaak, and they agree to create a stay-behind network in peacetime, so the risks of wartime improvisation don't repeat. Funding and material flow through the Americans and British. There are gold coins, literal pieces of gold, to serve as escape and survival money for agents. The secrecy is obsessive. Even friendly services don't want to discuss it openly. Italy builds its version in the early 1950s. Officers are sent to England for training. Demonstrations in explosives and weapons. Parachute exercises, jumps into the Channel. Planning sessions with the British. The names of these men are never supposed to surface. They're told that only a handful of people will ever know. The problem is, in Italy, the main danger isn't described as the Soviet army. It's described as Italian communism with massive electoral strength. That shifts the center of gravity. A structure built for occupation starts being discussed as a structure for internal control. There are briefings, meetings, pressure. CIA representatives show up asking not about training quality, not about readiness for invasion, but about what the network will do against strikes, riots, nationwide unrest, against the rise of the Communist Party. The message becomes explicit. Funding and support are conditional. Plan internal measures. Program counterinsurgency. Use the structure. The Italian side pushes back. It's not in the stay-behind directives. It's not what Gladio was created for. Over time, especially after the mid-1960s, the pressure reportedly eases. But the conversation happened. The idea exists. And once an idea like that exists inside a secret apparatus, it never truly disappears. Meanwhile, the machinery on the ground gets built like a professional organization. Teams of 9, 2 leaders per team. Compartmented knowledge. Some know arms depots, some know food caches, some know cash reserves. In 1948, young men are armed. One remembers carrying a Sten. Grenades supplied by local Carabinieri commands, just in case the Communist Party refuses an election result, just in case a coup is attempted, like they claim happened elsewhere behind the Iron Curtain. And then the country starts bleeding. Piazza Fontana, train bombings, Brescia, Petteano, Bologna. A chain of massacres and unresolved attacks that become the heart of Italy's strategy of tension. Attack civilians, terrorize the public, push public opinion toward the state, toward the regime, toward security. Make people trade liberty for protection. Keep it running for decades, from roughly 1950 into the mid-1980s, until emergency becomes habit. An insider lays out the logic with brutal clarity. You don't attack the state. You attack the innocent. Women. Children. People not involved in any political game. Because if you frighten them enough, they'll beg for stronger authority. That's the point. And when the magistrates try to chase the truth, the state interferes, sometimes lightly, often brutally. Files are muddied. Evidence is redirected. Instead of helping judges find the truth, offices within the police and the services fix the cards so the truth can't be found, because the state can't convict itself. Petteano becomes the microcosm, A hidden arms cache is found beneath the church. Boxes of new weapons, never used, preserved like they were buried yesterday. One box contains a phosphorus bomb, so dangerous they clear everyone out except 2 bomb technicians. And then there are documents, directives, to mislead judges. Tell them the arms are contraband, German leftovers, anything but what they are. After Petiano, a familiar mechanism kicks in: cover the ideological matrix, cover the responsibility, redirect the investigation. A key detail is almost cinematic in its simplicity: how weapons are retrieved. A 1,000 lire note is torn in half. One half held by the person who needs the arms, the other by the commander at the barracks. Match the halves, and the cache opens. A secret military supply chain operating inside regular institutions. There's also the human contradiction. It's inconceivable, one witness says, that peripheral commands wouldn't inform central command after Petiano, especially because 3 carabinieri are killed. Yet senior officers cover it anyway. A general, Mingarelli, later convicted for poisoning the investigation, connected to the existence of a parallel structure operating in his jurisdiction. The sentence is reduced on appeal, but the stain remains. An officer covering the killers of his own men for political reasons later packaged as national security. And above it all sits the deeper, older compromise, the post-war decision to fold yesterday's enemies into today's anti-communist fight. One witness describes being held by OSS/X2 after the war, treated well, told to write his life story, asked if he wants to be parachuted north. Another tells how lists were stolen from German headquarters in Rome, names of people left in place as forces retreated. When the Americans arrived, they found those people already arrested. And a collaboration begins, always in agreement with my government, always reported upward. The point is clear: continuity. Personnel don't vanish, they get repurposed. Even Prince Valerio Borghese, the Black Prince, is described as protected, saved by Angleton in 1945 after surrendering in Milan. His formation signs a written commitment: take up arms with the Allies if conflict erupts with the Soviet Union. Later, on the night of December 8, 1970, during the Borghese coup attempt, an officer receives an order: conduct a public order exercise, deploy reliable men to sensitive points, prevent unrest. The code phrase is telling: activate the triangle requirement, a domestic readiness posture. The officer says he only knew of an anti-communist structure that should activate exclusively in case of invasion, not for internal politics. Then he's arrested in 1974 and faces a judge who keeps probing as if it's unconstitutional. His superiors are the same state, the same nation, the same power as the judge. He's trapped: tell the truth and violate military secrecy, or keep silent and let innocent people be prosecuted. A general sits beside him, says yes with words, no with gestures. That's the culture in a single scene: permission and prohibition, spoken and unspoken, built into the same breath. In that atmosphere, other parallel structures flourish: Freemasonry, international lodges, officers, magistrates, police, carabinieri, membership spreading through the upper levels. Then Liceo Gelli and the P2 Lodge, described not as an occult power center for the state, but an open power center hidden only from public opinion, operating with internal political tasks, internal subversion. It's treated as another parallel structure, comparable in function if not in uniform. And there's another layer: infiltration inside the extremist groups themselves, left and right, like mirrored operations. In Italy, it's said the Red Brigades were penetrated with difficulty because they were closed and efficient, but penetrated nonetheless. Names appear: Federico Umberto D'Amato, an operator whose career runs through fascist, anti-fascist, and Cold War eras, linking police security, European cooperation, and the founding of the Club of Bern, a permanent committee drawing European and American services together, meeting annually. He describes operations that aren't battlefield work, but political management. In 1962, an operation that uses far-right avanguardia nazionale to post pro-Mao slogans, an attempt to create a hyper-left current to the left of the Communist Party. The objective is always the same: shape internal politics through controlled extremism. When Moro is kidnapped in 1978, the questions tighten again. A carabiniere linked to the services, Pierluigi Ravasio, claims the services had an informant at the University of Rome who warned them in advance that morning. He says Colonel Guglielmi went to Via Fani, couldn't prevent it, and was in the area. Guglielmi later gives a strange explanation. He went for a lunch invite at 9 in the morning. Documents suggest he worked in internal security and may have been among the trainers at Capo Maraggiu, the Gladio base. The details are disputed, but the pattern is consistent: proximity, foreknowledge, deniability. Then there are the forensic oddities. Dozens of rounds in Via Fani, described as coated with a special long preservation varnish, lacking manufacturing dates, first assessments calling them ammunition associated with unconventional armed forces. Later, in the Red Brigade's print shop found immediately after Moro's killing, investigators find a printing machine linked to the services, specifically the special unit group associated with recruiting gladiators. Again, the boundary between the official and the clandestine blurs until it's barely a line at all. And while Italy bleeds, Belgium tells its own version. Same architecture, different crimes. A man describes being asked to coordinate special operations in the north of Luxembourg province. He has supplies at his home: ammo, radios, relays. One morning the news reports an attack overnight on a military camp in the Ardennes. Barbed wire cut, the armory hit, a commander shot. Inside the camp, he sees something that doesn't fit the public story: foreign soldiers, Americans. The Americans, he says, are too motivated, too eager, like they're playing the exercise too hard. They attack a gendarmerie post, even throw a defensive grenade. An operation planned against a barracks is supposedly cancelled at the last minute, but the Americans ask to be driven behind the barracks anyway, ready to attack the next day. He leaves with his wife. Later, he hears it continued. For weeks, the explanation given to civilian investigators is the usual fog: ordinary bandits, terrorists. Months pass before a phone call pulls back the curtain. He goes to France, meets a contact who explains it was a secret maneuver meant to recreate resistance and support operations like 1944, training, simulation, rehearsals. The commander later calls. The man recovered on the ground isn't dead, only badly wounded, now in a Liège hospital. His job that night was to transport soldiers dressed as civilians near the camp. After months, the authorities admit there was a maneuver, admit certain attacks were organized, then try to contain it by claiming one specific attack was planned, but deprogrammed at the last moment. Around the same time, Belgium is rocked by a different kind of terror: seemingly pointless killings, supermarket raids, gratuitous murders. The violence feels political because it doesn't match simple profit. Investigators suspect a destabilization strategy, like Italy. They suspect right elements inside secret services penetrated left groups, even killed their own police to deflect attention. The country lives with unanswered questions: who, why, and how a modern European state can endure years of slaughter without clarity. Then a journalist describes tracking the far-right youth networks, structures that change names, keep the same faces, paramilitary weekends in the Ardennes, automatic weapons fire, grenade throwing. Photos are taken, a story is published, and the response is immediate. The head of the gendarmerie goes on TV and says it never existed. A judge raids the journalist and calls it fabrication. Uniforms, photos, weapons, a masquerade. The pressure isn't subtle. The goal is to break the accusation before it spreads. In that same environment, a name surfaces: Paul Latinus, a man who was unknown until an interview, then suddenly becomes central, implanted inside the Front de la Jeunesse with specific missions. Teach organization for violence, attacks on immigrant cafes, military training, surveillance. The structure described around him is almost corporate. Above-level directions providing economic and operational support. A few key figures known only to other key figures. Europe divided into sectors. Belgium tied to a central group with West Germany and northern France. Inside the group, there's an internal security service. Everyone uses code names, often German. Members don't know one another. Recruitment is by sponsorship. You build an action branch for physical operations, an intellectual branch for intelligence, and even a university branch for specialized chemicals and explosives. Not crude sticks of TNT, but tailored materials acquired through a discrete pipeline. A meeting goes all night in a provincial restaurant. Latinus says he was tasked, by authorities he won't name at first, to build a secret resistance group in Belgium against Soviet penetration and against Belgian collaboration with the Soviets. He describes the risk as constant. You can end up with a bullet between the eyes. If local police stop you, you can't flash the truth. You get cuffed, interrogated like a criminal because the mission can't be spoken. Then comes the most damning detail: training delivered by people who are supposed to be the state itself. A commissioner from state security claims he infiltrated the group, yet he also gives private surveillance lessons in an apartment, arriving masked with a bodyguard called the Colonel, carrying a membership card with secret group initials. Another instructor is described as a common market security official, Robert, teaching explosive placement in stairwells, weapons assembly, shooting and killing without leaving traces. There are exercises in Brussels in May 1984. The trainees are told a young woman is the mistress of Carlos the terrorist, and they must watch her day and night. Another exercise, January to February 1984. They're told a Brussels couple are KGB agents, must be surveilled. And the investigators later remember that in February 1982, a couple was found with throats cut and gunshots to the head. The missions extend into the practical details of violence: reconnaissance of big stores, doors, locks, inspections, staff routines, security contractors, hours, layouts. You collect everything. You don't get told why it's. That's the system. You do your piece. Someone else decides how it will be used later. The grand point of interrogation isn't an accident. It's the design. By the time Gladio is publicly named, the story isn't just about secret weapons caches and wartime contingencies. It's about how a Cold War apparatus, built in absolute secrecy, justified by fear of the Soviets, created parallel channels inside democratic states. Channels that could recruit extremists, protect liars, muddy justice and, in the worst interpretations offered by witnesses and investigators, feed or exploit terror to shape politics. And the people inside it, some true believers, some opportunists, some pawns, end up saying the same thing in different languages. They were used. They were moved, like puppets. Plato's line comes up: men as marionettes in the hands of gods. One of them corrects it without really correcting it. In his case, he was a puppet, not of gods, but of ideas, and not of the secret services. And yet everything around him says the opposite, the same recurring pattern of protection, recruitment, denial, and direction. At the end, an image that's almost too perfect, an automaton, beautiful, moving, lifeless, an automa of politics, a juggler, a machine made to look alive, a system made to look legitimate, and behind it, a hidden hand keeping the rhythm, throwing the balls into the air, smiling for the crowd, insisting nothing is happening at all. When lucky Luciano landed back in Italy, he didn't come home as a conqueror. He came back under escort. He had left in 1946, after cutting a Christmas deal in Cuba, thinking he could rebuild from Havana. Then the Americans found out. Pressure came down hard. Cuba folded. Luciano was expelled, shipped back across the Atlantic, arrested on arrival in Naples, Sicily, Palermo, police watching him. His passport gone, his leverage thin. On paper, he'd lost. But Italy in 1947 wasn't just another country. The communists were surging, winning votes, organizing labor, taking towns. There was real fear in Washington that the island could turn red and drag the mainland with it. To men who saw the world in black and white, that was intolerable. Luciano had been useful before. During the war as governor of New York, Thomas Dewey had greenlit cooperation between the Mafia and the Office of Naval Intelligence. The docks in New York were controlled. Sabotage fears were neutralized. Franklin Roosevelt understood the bargain. This wasn't the moment to dismantle organized crime. It was the moment to make alliances. The Mafia controlled the waterfront. The war came first. In New Orleans, Silvestro Carollo, Silver Dollar Sam, made sure the docks there were just as secure. 2 ports, 2 mob bosses, same arrangement. After the war, the landscape shifted. The Manhattan Project had delivered the bomb, but secrets leaked. The Soviets built their own. The dollar had a challenger. Moscow had an ideology and an army. From Washington's view, that combination was an existential threat. They needed insurance. The idea was simple. Build a stay-behind structure. Hidden arms. Radios. Men trained to operate if the Soviets invaded, or if communist parties took power through elections. It had to be autonomous. It couldn't depend on a president staying in office, or a CIA director surviving a scandal. It had to be self-sustaining. A living organism. Officially, it would later be called Operation Gladio. Unofficially, it would be stitched together by men who already knew how to operate in shadows. For that to happen, some gangsters had to be out of America and back in Europe. Luciano's deportation wasn't just punishment, it was repositioning. The same year he was expelled from Cuba, Carollo was deported from the United States. They met again in Sicily. At the center stood Calogero Vizzini, the Sicilian boss of bosses. Vizzini mediated disputes between provincial clans. He had leverage with Christian democratic circles. After the 1947 Portella della Ginestra massacre, left-wing peasant movements were crushed. Fascists had been fought and killed during the war, but communism was different. Communism was permanent, it was political, it was organized. And for men like Vizzini, it was unacceptable. Luciano claimed he wanted no part of narcotics. He said it often. But black market goods, white appliances, American products, flowed into Europe and were sold cheap. The margins were enormous. His fingerprints were everywhere. Carollo didn't wait for permission. He used intelligence contacts and old dock routes to push narcotics back toward New Orleans. That corridor fed what would become the Genovese power base, and from there into Chicago, the Midwest, the Gulf states, New York, New Jersey. The pipeline expanded. Another deportee was Frank Coppola. Frank Three Fingers. Born in Partinico in 1899, he slipped into the United States in 1926, worked produce, then muscle. He lost 2 fingers during a robbery. Years later, he told the Italian Anti-Mafia Commission, "My shotgun exploded. To someone who robs banks, it can happen." He was a major trafficker, tied to the Detroit partnership under Angelo Melli, connected to the St. Louis family through Anthony Tony Giordano, close to Jimmy Hoffa. He shipped narcotics to Joseph Civello in Dallas and Frank Livorsi in New York. The FBI put him on its most wanted list. In 1948 he was expelled and sent back to Italy. He settled near Rome, invested in real estate, and presented himself as legitimate. Authorities believed he remained central to large drug operations until his death in 1982. Others followed: Joe Adonis, Carollo, Coppola. In France, the Corsican Mafia aligned. Turkish organized crime groups handled supply lines that still echo today. Narcotics became the bloodstream. The money moved through Europe to finance clandestine networks. Intelligence services needed funds that couldn't pass through official budgets. Drug cash required no congressional approval. The logic was cold. As long as the men at the top were politically reliable, anti-communist, anti-socialist, the machine would endure. Through the 1950s, a structure solidified. Big business. The CIA, European intelligence networks, the Vatican, banks willing to launder, Switzerland as a quiet reservoir. It wasn't a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. It was convergence, interests aligned. Luciano travelled. He went to London, stayed at the White House Hotel opposite Hyde Park. The building still stands. There, Meyer Lansky met him. They sat with high-ranking crime figures, discussing casinos, laundering hubs, routes. France was next. Accounts opened in Switzerland. The network widened. France, London, Turkey, Belgium, parts of Africa, Southeast Asia. Contacts stretched into Vietnam. The infrastructure wrapped around itself like a fist. What Luciano and Carollo achieved would have been unthinkable when they left Sicily as poor boys fleeing violence. Now they returned as power brokers. They controlled Sicily, politically, economically, strategically. They knew they held that authority because their American counterparts allowed it. They also knew it could be taken away. The Sicilian Mafia began to mirror its American cousin. Real estate, hospitality, construction, financial services, money laundering layered over narcotics. By the end of the century, Sicilian networks would be linked to an estimated majority of Europe's drug flow. Operation Gladio was not a single room or a single order. It was architecture. Arms caches buried across countries. Communication systems ready to activate. Men embedded who could resist occupation or intervene internally if necessary. Built in 1948 and 1949, it persisted into the 1990s. One of the longest-running clandestine frameworks tied to the CIA and its European partners. The bridge held gangsters, traffickers, politicians, intelligence officers. Luciano never held office. He never commanded an army. But he understood power. If communism threatened Italy, the Mafia would make sure it didn't take root. Not in Sicily, not on the mainland. The war after the war wasn't fought with uniforms. It was fought through docks, bank accounts, ballots, bombs, and backroom agreements. And the men who built it designed it to survive them. Presidents could resign. Directors could fall. Scandals could erupt. The organism would keep breathing. Luciano sat in Sicily and watched the tide turn. From 1947 through 1956, he still had the aura. The old boss in exile. The man who'd built the machine. But the world he'd ruled was changing shape. Quietly, then all at once. Power was sliding toward Vito Genovese, and Luciano could feel it even from across an ocean. Messages got slower. Loyalties got softer. The names coming through weren't his names anymore. Back in New York, Frank Costello was running Luciano's old corporation like a Fortune 500 outfit. Quiet money, quiet partners, quiet rooms, judges, politicians, public officials, suits and envelopes. Costello believed you could run a family like a boardroom if you had enough friends on the inside. Vito didn't believe in that kind of safety. Vito believed you had to be seen. On the street. In the clubs. In the neighborhoods where men remembered what you did, not what you donated. When he returned from Italy and beat his case, Costello greeted him like family. He brought him into the light, took him to a major political convention, packed with elected men and connected men, all breathing the same air. Costello wanted Vito to understand the real value of power, legitimacy, a clean name, a respectable front that kept prosecutors and cops arguing with shadows. He even offered to groom him. "You take over," was the implication. "I'll make you safe enough to wear the crown." Costello thought he was teaching Vito the future. What he forgot was the past. At a table with men like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the old fault lines showed. Costello was married to a Jewish woman. He treated Jewish partners as business, not blood. He talked about bringing in Lepke, another earner, another tool. To Costello, it was simple. Capacity, profit, control. To Vito, it hit somewhere uglier. Genovese snapped and threw a racial slur across the table, demanding why Costello was always trying to bring in more Jewish gangsters instead of Italians. Before Lansky or Siegel could even move, Costello looked Vito dead in the face and said what Vito never forgave. "You're nothing but a dirty fucking foreigner yourself." It wasn't just an insult. It was a needle pushed into the one place Vito was soft. Costello was reminding him that Vito wasn't Sicilian royalty. He played Sicilian. He acted like an insider. But to real Sicilians, anyone who wasn't Sicilian was an outsider, another foreigner, another stranger. Costello thought the lesson would sting and pass. Luciano watched Vito's face when it happened and understood the truth immediately. Vito would collect that debt. He had the patience of a lizard and the memory of an elephant. He didn't explode. He stored it. And while Costello was busy cleaning him, helping him win, parading him through politics, Vito was doing what he always did, planting himself in the ground and letting the roots spread. Because Vito had already proven back in Sicily what kind of operator he was. In Italy, he'd helped Mussolini dismantle old dons, then rewired the island's industries into New York's orbit. Tomatoes, citrus, olive oil, cheese, whatever could move on a ship. He hotwired Sicily's economy into Mafia logistics and fed it straight into the Profaci family and other crews that knew how to sell it, tax it, and launder it. Ships, ports, transportation networks. Everything went wide. Everyone made a fortune. And Vito made sure the New York families knew exactly who built the pipeline. He shook hands. He showed respect. He treated them like kings. He wasn't just earning, he was buying tomorrow. So when Costello brought him into that political convention, Genovese didn't see a room full of killers. He saw fat businessmen living off envelopes, men who grew soft because Costello's money made them feel safe. Vito didn't want a family that survived on smiles and favors. He wanted a family that survived on fear and discipline. For politics, he had men like Russell Bufalino, quiet movers who could handle the formalities. Vito's issue was Costello himself. Costello was drifting away from the street, away from the kind of men who could still pull a trigger without hesitation. And Vito believed that kind of distance was fatal. Then the city started bleeding. The death of Willie Moretti, the disappearance of the Mangano brothers, a few more killings that didn't make sense to civilians, but made perfect sense to men who read power like weather. Each one was a signal. Each one moved the furniture. And then Costello said it out loud. He wanted to retire. Luciano heard it through Patsy Eboli and Tommy Eboli and felt his stomach turn. The idea of Costello stepping away wasn't just a career move. It was a surrender of the board. It meant the old era was ending. Luciano's era, the system he'd built and handed down. It meant men were already choosing sides. Joe Adonis, once aligned with Luciano, was drifting toward Genoese. Deportations were coming. The old guard was thinning. You needed good men in New York, men you could trust, because exile was death by distance. Luciano had learned that lesson the hard way. Still, he wasn't ready to be put in the ground. He still had fight in him. What he didn't fully grasp, what none of them wanted to admit, was how far Vito would go, and how ugly it would get once he started taking what he believed was his. Then the shots came. Costello was hit and lived. Anastasia was murdered, cut down in public, the kind of execution that didn't just remove a man, it rewrote the city's balance. Costello took a short prison sentence and then folded his hand, retiring into comfort, living out his days in a mansion like a retired executive who'd cashed out at the top. Vito looked around and saw the chair, and he believed it was his, alongside Carlo Gambino, who was building power the quiet way with time and votes and placement. Genovese wanted to be crowned king. Instead, he stepped on a landmine. Because 1957 didn't just bring violence, it brought daylight. Robert Kennedy had launched his war on union corruption, kickbacks, murders, organized muscle embedded in labor. He wanted blood. He wanted redemption. He'd been part of the McCarthy hearings, and the stain had followed him. This time, he was going to be the one asking the questions with the cameras pointing in the right direction. His father had greenlit what he thought would be a manageable crusade. It turned into something bigger. Because the same year the shooting climate in New York was turning lethal, upstate New York produced a picture nobody could explain away. 3 weeks after Anastasia went down, November 14th, 1957, the one thing even Hoover couldn't shrug off detonated in Appalachin. Joe Barbara's place outside Binghamton, a so-called barbecue. A visit to a sick friend. Steak smoke on a hill and out-of-state plates stacked at motels that never saw tourists in November. Sergeant Edgar Croswell didn't need a snitch. He needed eyes. He saw the plates. He saw the money men. He brought in Treasury and cops. They rolled up at 1 in the afternoon, in plain sight, writing license numbers first. The party came apart the moment the law arrived. Men scattered into woods. Cars were stopped on country roads. A convention turned into a harvest. Headlines said 62. Early counts ran closer to 64. The next day they were saying 65. The exact number didn't matter. The image did. Vito Genovese and his peers had called a national meeting, and state troopers caught them between coffee and dessert. No guns. Just cash. Fat on every man. One carried 10 grand. The rest had hundreds, thousands. They came from everywhere. New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, California, Texas, Colorado, Florida, Pennsylvania, plus Cuba and Puerto Rico. The cover story was insultingly simple. Visiting a sick friend. Barbara, 51, said he'd had heart attacks. Good to see my friends. The Hill said otherwise. They identified and released them. No charges. But the names mattered. Genovese, 59, Dewey's king of the rackets. Profaci, the quiet produce boss with real weight. Natale Evola, Vincent Rao, Paul Castellano, butcher on paper. Joe Bonanno and underboss John Bonventre. Russell Bufalino, a drapery man. Mike Miranda, Frank Zito, John Scalish. Frank DeSimone, California lawyer with a second resume. Joe Magliocco, Joe Ida, Joe Tivello out of Dallas, Frank and Costenze Valenti, Cockeyed Louis, Larasso. Carlo Gambino listed as labor relations. Traficante Jr. from Havana, calling himself a hotel manager. The papers printed the lie they told, then printed the truth they couldn't hide. These men weren't visiting a heart patient. They were redrawing the map after Anastasia. Coin machines, vending, garbage hauling, bread and butter rackets that printed cash, while Senate committees stared at New York's trash. And now the country had a photograph of the structure, an outline of a shadow government. In Palermo, Luciano heard the news the way bosses always hear bad news. Fast, wrong first, worse when confirmed. The rule he'd drilled into everyone was clear. Major meetings happen only on home turf. Atlantic City when Nucky ran it. Chicago when the ground belonged to them. Havana when Havana was theirs. Never right after a major hit. Never where you couldn't control the ground. Genoese ignored every rule and picked a hill in upstate New York because it felt quiet. Bufalino arranged. Barbara hosted. The quiet wasn't theirs. The fallout rolled straight into Washington. The arrests put committees back on camera, and two names benefited most: John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. Within 3 years, Jack rode hearings and headlines into the White House. Robert took justice and turned organized crime into a priority. He started connecting the dots: union corruption, the same names, the same union officials from Appalachin giving job titles like they were wearing costumes. Luciano understood what the cameras meant. He wanted Genovese dead. He'd ordered bigger deaths before, Masseria, Maranzano, when it served the future. But now he did the math. From exile, with his lines fraying, he saw the price. Either his life or his family's. He held his fire and watched the new guard tighten their grip. Gambino, Accardo, Giancana, Trafficante, Vito. Men who didn't fear deportees. Men who believed distance was weakness, and proved it. That was the lesson. Once you were gone, your power rotted. And yet Luciano still meant something in Sicily. Palermo respected him. So did the men who mattered there. Gambino kept his lines clean because his roots ran back to Palermo, and he was building power the slow way. Patient, methodical, always thinking 3 moves ahead. One message came through clear. Frame Vito. Costello wanted Vincent Chin Gigante punished for missing his shot. Gambino had housekeeping of his own. Carmine Galante needed a cell to cut Joe Bonanno's legs. 2 tracks formed, one aimed at Washington, an underworld mistake that would echo for years, and one aimed straight at putting Genovese behind steel. Narcotics would be the charge. Build it, box it, close it. The first pass missed. Luciano raged. Gambino promised results. Vito first, then Galante, then the rest. He understood the new arithmetic. Control wasn't in speeches or in salutes. It was in who set the table, who called the vote, and who chose the courthouse. Appalachin had blown secrecy. The answer was to use the light like a weapon. Then Genovese made his own move. Public, staged, calculated. Late 1958, he let 2 Australian reporters into his kitchen in Atlantic Highlands. He wore an apron. He cooked chicken cacciatore. He played humble. A rented weatherboard cottage, $100 a month. 5 suits, the newest 2 years old. A dozen shirts, 3 pairs of shoes. No marble staircase. No guards. No gun on the table. He smiled and said he cooked because he was fussy about food. It was theatre for jurors he hadn't met yet. He was going to trial as the alleged head of an international narcotics combine. His estranged wife claimed he'd hidden 32 million overseas. He waved it off. Women, 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 and accused her of inventing stories. Dog tracks, race tracks, power plants in Italy, nightclubs, the Italian lottery, Swiss safe deposit boxes. On Mussolini, he denied everything. Never met him. Only saw him in pictures. 2 weeks later, the mask slipped. July 8, 1958, UPI. Moved the crackdown story. Genovese arrested at Atlantic Highlands. Gigante grabbed earlier in Greenwich Village. A sealed indictment opened the frame. Hundreds of pounds of narcotics smuggled annually. U.S. Attorney Paul W. Williams called Genovese the hub, and Gigante, a rising star. He said it could drive the Mafia out of business. The papers ran Vito's record like a prayer. Arrests dating back to 1917, homicide, felonious assault, hooks that never set. Delegate at Appalachin. Gambling, vice, waterfront rackets layered over narcotics. And the one person willing to talk was the one person who knew his life from the inside. Anna Genoese detonated. In court she asked for separate maintenance and gave the judge a ledger. Vito earned $40,000 a week from narcotics, gambling, waterfront labor rackets, a lottery in New York's Italian district, dog and horse operations, plus legitimate interests. She described drunken parties at their Atlantic Highlands mansion, Costello, Anastasia, trips to Europe with $100,000 in cash for syndicate business, weekly bundles of 20 to 30 grand, tucked into safe deposit boxes, in Atlantic Highlands, Red Bank, New York, Naples, Switzerland. The court refused his divorce, ordered $300 a week. Vito claimed he only took home $125. Then he sold furniture to prove it. May 1953, the Plaza Art Galleries auctioned off the kind of domestic details that don't belong to working men. A huge mirrored headboard, peach satin spread, matching Chinese motif TV and piano, Limoges dinner set, sterling punch bowl, marble lamps shaped like half-dressed girls. The tabloids loved it. The prosecutors loved it more. It wasn't evidence of narcotics. It was evidence of a lie. And the government didn't build the case on Anna alone. They reached back to the 1950 Senate Crime Committee. Witnesses played dumb. Never heard of him. Takeover's staff kept pushing. They built the dossier. Vito arrived May 23, 1913. First gun pinch at 19. A dozen more arrests. Homicide, assault, robbery, concealed weapons, narcotics. In the 30s, he carried for Luciano and rose into management, introduced as the Great One. Then, the old murder came back. 1934. A crooked card game, a rich mark, $116,000. Ferdinand the Shadow Boccia demanded his share and had crossed Vito before. Vito convened his circle, Peter DeFeo, Gus Frasca, George Smurra, Mike Miranda, and wrote Boccia's death warrant. He perversely hired Willie Gallo and Ernest the Hawk Rupolo to do the job, then told Rupolo to shoot Gallo afterward. The plan stalled. Boccia stayed alive for weeks. Other shooters finished him on September 9, 1934. Rupolo tried to shoot Gallo, botched it, and Gallo lived long enough to talk. Later, Rupolo flipped after botching another murder and tied Vito to Boccia's killing, naming another witness, Peter LaTempa. Then LaTempa died too. Poisoned in Brooklyn Civil Prison, January 15, 1945, 7 days after U.S. Army CID officer O.C. Dickey got orders to bring Vito back to New York. Dickey's Naples file was a different kind of damning. During wartime Italy, Allied supplies were stolen and sold on the black market. Dickey tracked it and found Genoese everywhere. Passes, badges, stolen trucks loaded with flour and sugar, Canadians in American uniforms delivering to a vineyard near Nola, using the password "Genoese sent me." Equipment burned afterward to erase the trail. Dickey raided Vito's Naples apartment and found papers tying him to the racket and a shortwave receiver used with long-range transmitters. The transmitter never surfaced. The question, spy, hung in the air. So did the money. Gold seal. U.S. Currency, moving through hands that weren't supposed to have it. Dickey held him 6 months and fought his own chain of command to ship him home. No one met him at the dock. Time did what time does. Witnesses vanished. Evidence rotted. June 11th, 1946, Judge Samuel Leibowitz watched the Boccia case collapse and told Genoese that if there'd been even a shred of corroborating evidence, he believed Vito would have been condemned to the chair. Vito sneered and walked. He stepped right back into the underworld above Costello and Anastasia, while Luciano, paroled and shipped to Italy on murky wartime claims, rebuilt from Palermo. The dope liaison tightened the loop, Luciano abroad, Vito at home. One fed networks, the other controlled streets. By 1958, the loop was tightening into a noose. Justice moved to strip Vito's citizenship. Deportation buzzed. Dickey was called again to relive the Naples file. 10 days later came the indictment story and the wire photos. Vito named The Hub. Gigante labeled Rising Star. In the hearings and in courtrooms, the Fifth Amendment became a soundtrack. And then 1957 came back around again, because Appalachin wasn't just a scandal, it was a roster. Genoese and the Old Guard had been arrested in one place like a secret society caught mid-ritual. Robert Kennedy saw the names, union corruption, violence, kickbacks, and then saw those same union officials on Croswell's list. Carlo Gambino calling himself Labor Relations, Trafficante calling himself a hotel manager. Men who made their living on fear suddenly describing themselves like they worked at a desk. That's when it stopped being a labor story and became an organization story. Back rooms reacted faster than Washington. Genovese was asked about the convention and took the Fifth again and again, roughly 150 times. The underworld didn't care about civics. It cared about consequences. And the consequence of Appalachin was simple. The country had finally learned what it was looking at. Now the government started picking them off wherever the evidence fit. Tax, passports, narcotics. January 1959, jury selection crawled forward in federal court. 17 co-defendants with Vito, worldwide links, the government said. The defense tried delays, wanted to grill customs agent Benjamin Robert Beggendorf over an unauthorized visit, hinting at entrapment. The government said the agent wouldn't be called. The appellate court denied the stay. The room kept filling with jurors. Outside, the pattern was visible. Hits stayed unsolved while ordinary murders cleared. Professional shooters crossed state lines and vanished. Witnesses didn't see anything. Evidence evaporated. Committees warned witnesses not to say anything that might get them killed. Hoover's line was colder. Every unsolved crime encourages the next one. By March 1959, the pressure turned mechanical. Agents hit a Bronx walk-up looking for Nick Tolentino. As they closed in, a heavy man came down the stairs and walked into cuffs. Big John. Ormento, 47, 240 pounds, smirking like the handcuffs were jewelry. Acting U.S. Attorney Arthur Christie laid it out to Judge Edmund Palmieri. Ormento was a chronic narcotics violator, a close associate of traffickers, and an Appalachin delegate. Palmieri set bail like a warning shot. $150,000 for Ormento, $100,000 for Tolentino. Separate indictments, separate pleas due the next morning. Ormento had been running since June, named with Genovese and 35 others in the dope conspiracy. Tolentino had disappeared on a different narcotics case in '58. 9 of 11 were already convicted. Ormento's record read like a life sentence broken into chapters. 3 years in 37 for narcotics, 8 years in 41, 2 years in 52, 4 years in 53, plus a bookmaker, fine like an afterthought. The government said he worked supply lines from Europe and Mexico and used the usual rackets, garment, trucking, waterfront, where force moves freight and the books stay dark. At the same time, the public language changed. Papers stopped whispering and started printing the word Mafia, not as rumor, as structure, as a national organization tied to narcotics, gambling, labor rackets, and political protection. The thing Hoover wouldn't say out loud was now on front pages. Inside Vito's courtroom, the government kept it simple. Ex-agent Daniel Moynihan testified to a clean buy, a midtown hotel meet, a package tucked in a newspaper on a phone booth shelf, $275 exchanged, lab test confirmed pure heroin. No romance, no code, just product and cash. Defense lawyers fought the judge, fought procedure, fought tone. It didn't slow the machine. By mid-March, the trial had run 11 straight weeks. Tempers snapped. Judge Alexander Bix told defense counsel to sit down. Objections went on the record. The grind continued. Upstate, they tightened the screws on the hosts and the delegates. Joe Barbara Sr., the man who hosted the Appalachin Hill, was indicted for tax evasion. $14,600 unpaid, $38,000 unreported income, false corporate returns, potential $80,000 fines and prison. He'd claimed illness every time subpoenas came. Bail was set at $10,000. His son faced perjury for swearing the old man couldn't travel, while investigators said he had. And New York's Court of Appeals upheld contempt orders against Appalachin witnesses who refused to talk even after immunity. Names that would later become history. Paul Castellano, Carmine Lombardozzi, Frank and Costenze Valenti, Mike Miranda, Rosario Mancuso, Joseph Riccobono. Chairman Jacob Grumet called it a milestone. Immunity meant you answer, and refusal meant you sit in a cell until you remembered how to speak. Thread it together, and you can see what Luciano saw years earlier from Sicily. The old world was dying. The new world was built on different tools. Costello thought politics was the future. Vito thought politics was a convenience. Luciano understood something darker, that once the cameras found you, once the committees learned your names, once the courts started keeping score, the street rules didn't disappear. They just adapted. The underworld didn't become cleaner, it became smarter, more insulated, more willing to let prosecutors do the killing through indictments. Appalachin was the moment secrecy cracked. After that, every move was made under a harsher light. And in that light, Vito Genovese, the man who'd survived murders, files, wars, poisonings, and vanished witnesses, was finally sitting still long enough for the country to count what he'd done. The war had already begun. Nobody was going to call it off. By 1937, Luciano's outfit was already thinking past New York. Costello was tightening his grip on the political side, judges, fixers, friendly faces in city offices. But the real expansion was happening where the heat was lower and the corridors were wider. The South. A place where corruption wasn't a problem to solve. It was the local language. When Lansky showed up with Costello, both men were stunned, not by violence, but by how casually the whole region could be bought, traded, and managed like inventory. Vegas didn't exist yet, so the scaffolding had to be built somewhere else. To grow a national network, casinos, money laundering, political protection, no one started from scratch. They plugged into an existing machine. And down there, Silver Dollar Sam Carolla already had one. Fully established, fully grown. A stable New Orleans outfit with young recruits moving up, men who understood docks, unions, discipline. Costello didn't need another loud boss. He needed a foundation that didn't shake. That's when Carlos Marcello started to enter the picture. Marcello wasn't flash, he was the ledger. He ran the operations that mattered to the Southern Pipeline and made sure every dollar was accounted for. Costello seeded slot machines with various families across New Orleans and Louisiana, but Marcello's syndicate was the only one he trusted to keep the count exact. Marcello didn't skim. He exceeded the amount Costello asked for and delivered it straight back, untouched, like a message. This operation could be built on reliability, not noise. Costello respected that. In that world, respect becomes authority. So Marcello got more territory, more responsibility, and more exposure to the bigger architecture. One of the first major symbols of that shift was the Beverly Club, an early casino nerve center before the Strip ever had a pulse. Lansky, Costello, Luciano's orbit, elites, and Louisiana's political operators all had money in it. The Beverly wasn't a neighborhood racket. It was a system. Slot machines, a racing wire setup feeding information from tracks and events across the country. Cash moving through a place that looked like entertainment and functioned like a bank. A multi-million-dollar operation, not on the floor. And once a place like that works, it attracts a certain kind of customer. Not just gamblers, but men with networks, men established in Louisiana with reach into Boston, men who understood what ports really meant. During the Second World War, the ports belonged to the Italian Mafia, New York to Boston to New Orleans to Galveston. They decided what got loaded, what got offloaded, what disappeared, what arrived late. Control the docks and freight becomes leverage. Leverage becomes politics. Politics becomes immunity. That's how big business starts to feel gravity. Because down in the Gulf, the docks weren't only about slot machines and cash anymore. They were a gateway to the Caribbean. The company that dominated those corridors wasn't a gang. It was an empire. United Fruit. A banana empire so vast, it didn't just change landscapes, it changed regimes. Nearly 1 million acres across Jamaica, Cuba, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Panama, and Colombia. Thousands of miles of railroad. A fleet of 65 steamships, one of the largest in the American merchant marine. Radio stations, commissaries, hotels, hospitals, waterworks, power plants, even a snake venom lab. 70,000 workers. An internal economy so complete it sold millions in American goods back to its own laborers. 1,200 round trips a year. 60,000 passengers. Over 1 million tons of cargo. Havana to Cartagena, Panama to San Francisco. An American corporate state moving on water and diesel. And it started the way empires always start. Cheap and bold. A few bunches bought in Jamaica for coins, sold in New York for dollars. Boston Fruit turning novelty into industry. Minor Keith laying rail through Costa Rica, planting bananas along the right-of-way to finance steel through jungle. Then the merger, then the capital, then the Great White Fleet expanding from 4 ships into a transport arm with global reach. Then came Sam Zemurray, an immigrant from Bessarabia with a gambler's instincts and a revolutionary's nerve. He learned Spanish and poker, made friends with politicians, and decided he didn't need United Fruit. He could compete with it. In 1910, he financed a revolution in Honduras to restore Manuel Bonilla. Bonilla repaid him with land concessions. Zemurray built Cuyamel Fruit and made himself rich, making himself a problem. United Fruit bought him out in 1930, 300,000 shares, around $20 million, and barred him from competing. So, he took the company instead. When the Depression hit and United Fruit stock collapsed, Zemurray walked into the boardroom with certificates and proxies and seized control. They had forbidden him from competing. They hadn't forbidden him from owning them. Once in charge, he cut valuations, saved millions, fired executives, toured the empire, and told managers to stop theorizing and start producing. The stock jumped. The old president resigned. Zemurray became the power, street peddler turned emperor, admiral of a fleet that could move cargo, passengers, money, and influence through the same Caribbean corridors where dictatorships, intelligence interests, and underworld networks intersected. That intersection mattered, because the South was becoming the hub for everything New York couldn't stabilize. New York was too tight, too crowded, too many bosses fighting for the crown, too many eyes on every racket. The Southern families were spread out, territorial, rooted. Their stability wasn't weakness, it was an asset. Lansky said it plainly in the mid-30s into the 40s. New Orleans would be the home of communications and money laundering for organized crime. Luciano understood what that meant and backed it. So, the shift is visible in the landmarks. The Roosevelt Hotel, the Beverly Club, the operators sliding into place. Phil Castell, Seymour Weiss, men who didn't need to posture because the system itself was the power. New Orleans was stable. Stability is what matters when building networks meant to outlive administrations. That's why Gladio and related structures fit here, not as slogans, but as architecture. Autonomous systems built to survive resignations, scandals, elections, director changes. A living organism linking gangsters, narcotics traffic, politicians, banks, and intelligence services. The South becomes the quiet heart because it can keep beating without the spotlight. Up north, after the war, the intelligence relationship ran through syndicate corridors, Russell Bufalino and the Pennsylvania network with industrial backers and political insulation. Trafficante plugged into those lines. Old relationships stretched back decades. In that ecosystem, the Anastasia hit becomes less mystery and more function. Alliances, familiarity, a chessboard being cleared. Trafficante ordering Anastasia, Marcello absorbing Carola's operations. The Southern machine pivoted into legitimacy, intelligence facilitation, casinos, clean fronts that could carry dirty money indefinitely. Marcello understood it better than most. By the 1950s into the 60s, it wasn't only rackets, it was a syndicate designed to resemble a regional power structure. Legitimacy as camouflage. Unions, businesses, politicians, ports, the Caribbean corridor. The scale becomes the message. Texas alone produces staggering profit. Territory so large it could swallow entire countries in comparison. Control that kind of territory, and everything inside it becomes negotiable. That was Marcello's moment. A chance to sit at the top with Trafficante and the Southern syndicates and let New York burn itself out. Because New York always did. New York was built on betrayal. Luciano proved it when he took down bosses to build the commission. Later, Gambino used the same playbook: eliminate Anastasia, reshape the board, then move on Genovese. Luciano couldn't object without indicting himself. From Sicily he recognized the move because it was his move, perfected by men still on the ground. But chaos never stays quarantined. Bonanno makes his attempt. New York stays the home of ego and mutiny, and later the late-era collapse comes with men like Gotti. Attention dragging families into the light until the old rules stop working. New Orleans survives because it never needs applause. Marcello never retired. That's the difference. Others stepped back. Marcello held the seat from the 1930s into the 1980s, recognized until death. And when he finally handed power off, it went back into the bloodline, back to the Carola family, because in New Orleans, family ranked above everything. Then the camera swings south, not because New Orleans got reckless, but because New York made the entire structure visible. Appalachin, the hearings, the headlines, Robert Kennedy dragging names into the public record. Organized crime. Stops being rumor and becomes target. Marcello becomes one of Kennedy's first obsessions. Kennedy didn't understand what he was grabbing at. His father tried to talk him out of it, but Robert had his teeth on it like a pit bull and wouldn't let go. He joins McClellan, walks into that world, and immediately runs into men like Aaron Cohen, an investigator on Marcello since the 1950s, a man who did time refusing to expose informants, a man who lived the consequences of naming the system. And while the Kennedys chase headlines, while Joseph Kennedy tries to manufacture a presidency, the machinery underneath keeps running. Operations solidified over time don't stop because a committee chair gets loud. Gladio flourishes. Operation X continues. Operation Ajax didn't just reset Iran's government in 1953, it reset the balance of power in the region. Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized oil. The West responded with covert action. Street mobs were organized, military officers were bribed. Political pressure was applied until the Shah returned to full authority. Iran was pulled firmly back into the Western orbit. In the years that followed, Tehran became a showcase of controlled stability. Oil flowing, intelligence cooperation tight, Western influence embedded deep into the state. The Shah's Iran opened its doors to business, glamour, and elite culture. Western entertainers performed there. Frank Sinatra sang in the Shah's Iran while the regime projected modernity and strength to the world. On the surface, it looked like progress. Underneath, resentment fermented. The security apparatus expanded. Savak enforced loyalty. Opposition was suppressed. The memory of Mossadegh's overthrow never disappeared. It hardened. By the late 1970s, that buried anger crystallized into revolution. The Shah fell. Ayatollah Khomeini rose. The Western-backed order collapsed almost overnight. Iran was not unique. In Guatemala, Operation PBSUCCESS followed the same blueprint. Jacobo Arbenz threatened united fruit through land reform. The CIA armed and trained exiles under Carlos Castillo Armas. Psychological warfare amplified the illusion of a mass uprising. Arbenz fell. A new regime stepped in. Corporate interests were protected. Across multiple theaters, a pattern emerged. Remove the nationalist reformer, install the compliant strongman, stabilize the flow of resources, suppress opposition through intelligence networks. And in environments shaped by covert power, corruption rarely disappears. It adapts. Where oversight weakens and intelligence agencies operate behind the curtain, informal networks grow. Smugglers, fixers, political brokers, organized crime figures who provide logistics, money channels, and plausible deniability. These ecosystems thrive in the shadows created by coups. Stability on the surface, transactions underneath. Then Cuba becomes a mess, but intelligence believes it has backups. In Havana, the story turns poisonous. Prio bribed and fleeing, Batista taking power, Batista demanding more money, growing more brutal. The dictators tell when the end is close. Castro in the mountains, armed and gathering momentum. Competing backers circling him. Disillusioned student rebels. Factions turning against Batista's brutality. Opportunists betting on the winner. The underworld fractures hard. Traficante's syndicate moves in its own orbit. Resentment grows toward Lansky because Lansky and Luciano moved into Cuba without Traficante's permission. And beneath the money sits the deeper truth. Traficante's family held something cash couldn't buy. Loyalty inside the Cuban middle and upper classes, family names built over decades. Cuba wasn't a casino island. It was an ecosystem. When Castro takes Havana in 1959, he picks a side, and the men around him learn what that means. Fighters who believed they were building a new country find themselves betrayed. Some escape, some go to prison, some become assets, some become enemies. The rage hardens. The rage looks at Washington and sees betrayal. Nixon speaking well of Castro, while the underworld's investments and protections collapse. Now, it's public. Now operations are at risk of exposure. And the Kennedys, front page, hearing rooms, campaign energy, treat organized crime like a national stage. But Robert doesn't let go. He carries the war into the White House and keeps digging. And as the digging deepens, the architecture starts to show itself. Operation Underworld, Gladio, hidden pipelines, politicians greased, blackmail running, Hoover compromised. Intelligence operates like a system that can partner with violent specialists because they're useful. Dictators backed, Narcotics logistics facilitated. Money laundering turned into infrastructure. In that frame, the fight isn't only against the mob, it's against the machinery that protects it. Kennedy finds parts of it repugnant, but power doesn't work like a clean sermon. Operations are inherited. Operations are used. Bay of Pigs, Mongoose, Northwoods, JM Wave, ZR Rifle. Some move with or without full knowledge, but fingerprints appear anyway because the presidency doesn't erase the apparatus. It sits inside it. That's the realization that lands hardest. These networks don't vanish. They evolve. What begins as dock control and gambling money and wartime alliances becomes a permanent system. Corporate, political, criminal, intelligence, interlocked and self-protecting. The public learns it decades later. Kennedy starts learning it in real time. And once that room is seen, once it's clear who counts the money, who moves the ships, who owns the politicians, everything else makes sense. Why New Orleans mattered before Vegas, why Marcello rose, why Cuba detonated, why Robert Kennedy's war wasn't just dangerous, it was existential. Because he wasn't pulling at a thread on a suit. He was pulling at the stitching holding the whole thing together. When the guns fell silent over Cuba and the dead began to be counted, the humiliation was immediate and public. Prisoners were paraded. Executions were whispered about in the dark. Exiles who had believed Washington stood firmly behind them found themselves abandoned in Cuban prisons. Harsh cells, interrogations, men dragged out at night, gunshots echoing into silence. The world would call it the Bay of Pigs invasion. For John and Robert Kennedy, it became something else, a revelation. The operation was not simply a failed invasion. It was a network. Arms pipelines, covert logistics, aircraft, cutouts, trainers, deniable funding streams. The names attached to it were familiar. Robert Kennedy had already cross-examined some of them during the McClellan Committee hearings. Now those same circles, organized crime, anti-Castro exiles, intelligence handlers, were colliding with official U.S. policy. 2 weeks before the invasion, Kennedy had done something that sent shockwaves through that network. Carlos Marcello, the quiet sovereign of New Orleans, was seized and deported. He was physically taken from the Masonic building on St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans, a structure originally built in 1926 as a Masonic temple. Gothic revival stone, marble halls, ritual chambers, Louisiana Freemasonry at the height of its social and political influence. And from that building, symbolic in more ways than one, the federal government touched one of the oldest criminal empires in America. Louisiana had long been fertile ground for parallel power. Jesuit institutions, Masonic lodges, Port Authority influence. In 1870, the first documented appearance of Charles and Tony Matranga marked the birth of what became the Matranga Crime Syndicate, the earliest structured mafia organization in New Orleans. That lineage ran forward, evolving into Marcello's empire. In some respects, that criminal structure predated or outlasted many of the city's civic monuments. It was generational, disciplined, territorial, stable. That stability mattered. Earlier, it had already been established that the South, particularly New Orleans, offered something New York could not: continuity. Ports connecting directly to Italy and Europe. Trade routes that reached the Caribbean, Central America, and beyond. Access, discretion, and distance from the constant volatility of northern families. It was precisely why the Southern Corridor became invaluable to covert logistics. When one studies operations like Operation Gladio, and later the P2 scandal in Italy, recurring patterns appear. Secret stay-behind structures, anti-communist networks, Freemasons within military intelligence, neo-fascist groups used as deniable instruments. Gold reserves hidden for contingency war. Arms caches buried in rural churches. Officers trained in Britain, parachuted from France or Belgium, guided to safe houses. The transcript fragments from Europe make the structure plain. British, American, French, and Belgian coordination. Invisible armies designed not for external war, but internal contingency, against a fifth column. A parallel structure operating beyond electoral cycles. Governments changed, networks did not. Italy's propaganda due, P2, demonstrated how financial elites, military intelligence, Freemasonry and political actors could converge inside a single covert architecture. When judges later uncovered links between terror bombings and clandestine state interference, the language used was telling. Strategy of tension. Violence designed to frighten the public into demanding order. The overlaps were not ideological. They were structural. In Belgium during the 1980s, unexplained supermarket massacres left dozens dead. Some investigators suspected destabilization efforts. Some of the networks referenced in those inquiries traced back to NATO-linked stay-behind planning structures, coordinated through Brussels. Even in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., it was later alleged that James Earl Ray was attempting to flee toward Europe, Belgium specifically, before capture. The geography appears again and again in Cold War counter-subversion frameworks. Back in New Orleans, fury simmered after the Bay of Pigs collapse. Guy Bannister raged openly about what he considered betrayal. A segregationist and staunch anti-communist, he increasingly despised the Kennedys, particularly after Martin Luther King Jr. was invited into the White House. David Ferry was equally furious. According to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, Ferry was stopped mid-speech in July 1961 while addressing the New Orleans chapter of the Military Order of World Wars, because his criticism of Kennedy over the Bay of Pigs fiasco became too extreme. Later reporting indicated Ferry admitted he might have used the phrase "he ought to be shot" as offhand venting over Cuba. Ferry had trained Cuban exiles in Guatemala. He had flown repeatedly in and out of Central America. He had helped facilitate false documentation for figures within Marcello's orbit. To men like him, the invasion was not an abstract policy mistake. It was personal. Friends had died. Networks had been exposed. The promise of American air cover had evaporated. What angered these networks most was not simply defeat. It was interference. Marcello's deportation 2 weeks prior to the invasion had signaled a new federal posture. The Kennedys were no longer tolerating the gray zone. By the summer of 1961, David Ferry was no longer operating in the shadows. His name was in the papers. In July, the Times-Picayune quoted him directly. He was working with the Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front, collecting food, clothing, medicine, furniture, anything that could be scraped together, for refugees arriving through the port of New Orleans after the failed April 17th invasion. Ferry spoke openly about the botched-up Cuban invasion. At a Roosevelt Hotel luncheon, he translated for Angel Maruri, an officer connected to the failed operation. The account detailed CIA recruitment, training bases in Guatemala and Nicaragua, leased land paid for with American money, an airstrip built for $175,000, machine gunners given 4 practice sessions before being sent into combat. It was all there, printed in black and white. Ferry was not hiding. Then, within weeks, his world collapsed. In August 1961, he was booked in Jefferson Parish on charges involving juvenile boys. Accusations followed: intimidation of witnesses, extortion, threats. Police reported rifles found in his home, maps, statements from teenagers. Court proceedings stretched into early 1962. Some charges were dismissed, others reversed and remanded. But that hardly mattered. The damage was public. A man deeply involved in Cuban exile circles, openly discussing CIA-backed training operations, was suddenly compromised. In New Orleans, compromise meant leverage. Carlos Marcello's organization understood leverage better than anyone. Marcello controlled the docks, the gambling circuits, the political favors, the unions. Unlike New York, New Orleans did not implode under internal wars. It was stable, insulated, and generational. Ferry, financially unstable, legally exposed, and furious at the Kennedy administration after the Bay of Pigs, needed protection. Marcello's network provided protection, influence, silence. Guy Bannister operated in the same orbit. Former FBI, hardline segregationist, anti-communist. His office on Camp Street sat at the intersection of private intelligence, Cuban exile activism, and militant politics. Attorney George Ray Gill handled legal strategy. Marcello fought deportation. Robert Kennedy pushed harder. In June 1962, another figure returned to New Orleans. Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald had known Ferry years earlier through the Civil Air Patrol. As a teenager, he attended CAP activities where Ferry was active. Ferry encouraged discipline, aviation, and direction. Oswald joined the Marines. He defected to the Soviet Union. Then, in mid-1962, he returned to the United States. The timing was critical. Ferry was under pressure. Marcello had been deported in 1961 and somehow reappeared in the United States shortly after. Rumors circulated in New Orleans that assistance had been provided quietly. Ferry, Bannister, and others were aligned in opposition to the Kennedy administration's crackdown. Nationally, 1962 was combustible. Joseph Valachi began speaking behind closed doors about the structure of organized crime. La Cosa Nostra entered federal vocabulary. Vito Genovese was in prison. Charles Lucky Luciano died in early 1962. His body was paraded through New York. Robert Kennedy saw the death of a criminal architect. Marcello saw an opening, room to consolidate southern and international channels linking Europe, the Caribbean, and the Gulf Coast. Meanwhile, covert operations accelerated. Anti-Castro programs expanded under Operation Mongoose. The Miami station known as JM Wave intensified activity. Assassination planning under ZR Rifle continued in fragments. Inside the CIA, figures like James Jesus Angleton and William Harvey maneuvered within a Cold War landscape that blurred legality and necessity. For years, elements of organized crime had been used as intermediaries in attempts against Fidel Castro. That record exists. The deeper consequence was structural. Once criminal networks were embedded into covert action, separation became difficult. When the Justice Department began prosecuting those same figures aggressively, equilibrium shattered. Ferry sat on that fault line. Publicly disgraced, deeply in debt, politically radicalized, connected to exile networks, linked to Bannister's private intelligence structure. Familiar with Oswald, tied indirectly to Marcello's circle. Whether Ferry saw Oswald as useful, ideological, or simply familiar remains debated. What is documented is contact. What followed would move Oswald between New Orleans, Dallas, and Mexico City, appearing in pro-Castro and anti-Castro contexts that still provoke dispute. By late 1962, the confrontation between the Kennedy administration and entrenched networks, organized crime, exile militancy, and segments of intelligence was no longer theoretical. It was personal. Programs such as Operation Gladio in Europe revealed that covert stay-behind structures were designed to survive governments. They were insulated, layered, autonomous. Structures built in war do not dissolve when administrations change. They adapt. If a president threatened exposure, the response was rarely open rebellion. It was insulation, compartmentalization, redirection. By 1963, Oswald would stand alone in official history. Ferry would deny involvement and die in 1967 before any final reckoning. Bannister would die earlier, leaving files behind in a Camp Street office already tied to anti-Castro activity. The exile networks continued. The Southern Syndicate remained stable. The intelligence apparatus endured. Systems built in secrecy are designed with redundancy. Remove one piece, and the structure absorbs the shock. The tragedy of November 1963 sits at the intersection of those systems: organized crime under federal assault, intelligence operations against Castro, exile fury after the Bay of Pigs, and compromised individuals moving between all three. Ferry was publicly active in exile politics. He was legally compromised months later. Oswald returned to New Orleans during that crisis. Marcello and the Kennedys were already at war. Everything else lives in the space between documentation and interpretation. And in that space, organized crime families, Detroit, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, the South, had long coexisted with intelligence actors, sometimes officially, sometimes without authorization. During World War II, the docks had been secured through Mafia intermediaries. During early Cold War anti-Castro planning, similar channels reactivated. The arrangement suited everyone, until policy shifted. Out of that tension emerged something more durable than any single administration: a hybrid network. Organized crime figures, anti-communist paramilitaries, intelligence officers, financiers. They understood one fact clearly: presidents served terms. They did not. The South was stable. It had ports linking to Italy and Europe. It had entrenched criminal families with generational loyalty. It had deep Masonic and ecclesiastical footprints. It had access to Caribbean corridors. It had insulation from New York's volatility. For covert logistics, whether anti-Castro, anti-communist or otherwise, that stability was invaluable. The Bay of Pigs was not merely an invasion that failed. It exposed the architecture beneath it. It revealed overlapping channels, exile militias trained abroad, intelligence services hedging bets, criminal syndicates providing deniable infrastructure. It revealed how quickly fury could turn inward. And for Robert Kennedy, it was the moment the lines began to connect. The names he had grilled in hearings were no longer abstract racketeers. They were embedded in covert policy. The deportation of Carlos Marcello was not an isolated legal maneuver. It was a strike against a Southern power base intertwined with ports, money, and quiet alliances stretching across the Atlantic. The humiliation in Cuba had consequences far beyond the beaches. Because once those hidden structures feel threatened, they do not dissolve. They adapt. Lee Harvey Oswald came back from the Soviet Union in June 1962, slipping into the United States like a man returning from a bad decision that still felt, to him, like a credential. He left Moscow by train on June 1st with Marina and their daughter, crossed by ship from Rotterdam to New York, and settled into the Dallas-Fort Worth area as if the whole trip had been a detour and not a declaration. But his name didn't settle. It kept moving. Through files, through informants, through agencies that watched each other as much as they watched him. In April 1963, he relocated to New Orleans and stayed there until late September. He wasn't quiet. He made noise in the one direction that guaranteed attention: pro-Castro agitation. He printed, he postured, he handed out fair play for Cuba committee literature in public, baiting confrontations. In August 1963, it turned into a street arrest after an altercation while distributing leaflets. The arrest wasn't the point. The headline was, the paper trail was. And in New Orleans, paper trails weren't innocent. They were tools. This is where Oswald begins to look less like an originator and more like a man being shaped. A small man with big fantasies and a soft center, a peace that could be moved. The summer heat in New Orleans brought him into the orbit of people who already lived inside the overlap between politics, exile militancy, and the underworld. David Ferry. The 544 Camp Street address. The same operational real estate that kept reappearing in the city's shadow history. Oswald's movement wasn't built like a real movement. It was built like a provocation, loud, crude, designed to be photographed, designed to be filed. By then, everyone was feeling pressure. Not just Oswald, the machinery around him. The old alliance, organized crime, anti-Castro warriors, and elements of US intelligence had been running hot since Cuba fell. The goal was obsessive and simple: get Castro. For years, ideology was the sales pitch, but power was the product. The same network kept turning up in different costumes: exiles, cutouts, fixers, former operators, men whose income never matched their job titles. They had one thing in common. They could move money, move people, and move stories. And when their operations started to risk exposure, they didn't shut down. They adapted. Then, in July 1963, the mood in Washington shifted in a way that made the hardliners and the exiles hear betrayal all over again. The United States and Britain signed an agreement with the Soviet Union banning nuclear bomb tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. Kennedy went on television and talked like a man trying to steer the country out of permanent war. Let us, if we can, get back from the shadows of war and seek out the way of peace. Détente. First steps, a different direction. To the anti-Castro diehards, that kind of language wasn't diplomacy. It was danger. It sounded like the door closing, on invasions, on raids, on the private war they'd been promised would never end. Groups like the DRE and Alpha 66, the militant edge of the exile world, saw the possibility they might have to live with the Soviet Union and live with Castro. And they weren't built for living with anything. By March 1963, those militants were already testing Kennedy's limits. Alpha 66 mounted provocative attacks on Soviet-linked targets in Cuban ports, including raids that shot up a Soviet freighter and installations, then followed with more strikes despite official warnings. Years later, Antonio Vecchiana, Alpha 66 founder, would tell investigators that those actions weren't just exile bravado. They were pushed, directed. He said his American intelligence handler, a man he knew as Maurice Bishop, pressed him to attack Soviet ships to cause trouble between Kennedy and Russia, to put Kennedy against the wall, to force a decision. Vecchiana described Bishop as a dirty tricks man, someone who believed Kennedy and his advisors shouldn't be running the country at all. That allegation matters because of what happens next, and because of when it happens. Oswald's New Orleans performances escalated as if he knew a clock was running. He didn't act like a man patiently building a political organization. He acted like a man trying to manufacture an identity that could be used later by someone else, in a different context. Pro-Castro leaflets, public confrontations, a ready-made narrative, communist sympathizer, Cuba advocate, troublemaker, the kind of label that could be pinned to a body. Late September 1963, Oswald left for Mexico. He departed on September 26th and arrived on the 27th. There's a gap in his documented movements between about September 23rd and the early morning of the 26th, when he shows up on a bus south of Houston headed toward Mexico City. In Mexico, he went where the story needed him to go, the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy. He wanted a transit visa to Cuba on his way to the Soviet Union. He carried a dossier, clippings about his New Orleans arrest, Fair Play for Cuba committee material, his membership card, presenting himself as a friend of the Cuban Revolution, a former resident of the USSR, a man with a Russian wife, the FPCC delegate in New Orleans, a Communist Party member. He pushed hard. He demanded speed. And the Cubans didn't buy him. Silvia Duran, a consulate employee whose job involved visas, later explained what didn't add up. A real sympathizer, a real FPCC person, didn't walk in off the street in Mexico City like a stranger. They got vetted. They had a letter. They had a channel. With him, she'd never heard of him. It didn't look right. Eusebio Azcue, the Cuban consul, later said the man he remembered as Oswald didn't physically resemble the Oswald arrested in Dallas. Others in Mexico City recalled an Oswald who was older, heavier, taller. The CIA's own description of a man calling himself Lee Oswald at the Soviet embassy on October 1st, 1963, reportedly didn't match Oswald either. Then there's the photograph. On October 1st, 1963, a photo was taken in Mexico City. The CIA initially claimed the man in it was Lee Harvey Oswald. FBI agents who knew Oswald said it was not him. The man didn't physically match. And later, the CIA quietly backed away from the claim. A photo that should have clarified identity became another artifact that made identity slippery. Oswald left Mexico City on October 2nd and crossed back into the United States on October 3rd. He came home by bus, mundane, anticlimactic, and returned not to New Orleans, where he'd spent the summer staging his pro-Castro persona, but to Dallas, where he would soon land a job at the Texas School Book Depository. He was now in place. The only question was whether he was in place as the shooter or as the name. What makes Mexico City toxic isn't just the visa failure, it's the phone calls. The CIA was tapping and watching those embassies. Mexico City's Soviet embassy was a center of Soviet intelligence in the Western Hemisphere, heavily monitored. There were tapes, calls where a man using Oswald's name spoke in terrible Russian, a giveaway, because Oswald's Russian, after nearly 3 years in the USSR, was reportedly decent. The voice didn't match the resume. The pattern suggested an attempt to get a record created. Lee Oswald called the Soviet embassy. Lee Oswald asked about a visa. Lee Oswald is connected to Cuba. A plan that needed files, needed phone calls. Some accounts describe clandestine techniques used to identify callers who didn't identify themselves. There are claims that operatives called the Soviet embassy to impersonate the mysterious American and to involve Silvia Duran. Though Duran swore she wasn't even in the consulate on the Saturday, a call supposedly placed her there, and the consulate was technically closed. The effect was the same either way. Oswald gets embedded into a record that can be cabled to Washington, a compromised identity created in real time. And that's where the name David Atlee Phillips enters the story. Phillips was CIA, Western Hemisphere Division, a propaganda specialist with deep anti-Castro credentials. He would later be tied to major covert action efforts, including the attempt to prevent Salvador Allende from becoming president of Chile. In Mexico City, he served in a position that put him close to Cuban operations at the exact time the station was discussing Oswald's Mexico City activity and the embassy phone calls. Phillips later suggested CIA photographic coverage was sporadic, which is why Oswald wasn't captured outside the embassies, and claimed recordings of bugged conversations were routinely destroyed a week or so after Oswald's visit. But the missing images and missing tapes didn't reduce suspicion. They concentrated it. Because if the goal were to build a file that said Castro did it, Mexico City was the staging ground. If the Oswald character was supposed to get into Cuba and couldn't, the fallback was to manufacture the association anyway, create the record without the result. Plan A, Cuba. Plan B, the paperwork that implies Cuba. Right in the middle of this, back home, another pressure wave hit, one that threatened the entire architecture connecting intelligence, exile operations, and the Mafia. on September 25, 1963. Senate hearings on organized crime opened with testimony from Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Joseph Valachi was scheduled shortly after. On September 27, 1963, Valachi officially testified publicly about the existence of La Cosa Nostra. On October 1st, he outlined the five-family structure in New York. The hearings continued through October with sessions on October 2nd, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 15th, and 16th. It wasn't just scandal, it was illumination. Valachi simply didn't name criminals. He described structure, how power was organized, how it communicated, how it enforced. He gave investigators a map. A map is lethal when people have been hiding in the terrain. If Kennedy stayed in power long enough, the fear wasn't just arrests. It was exposure of relationships. Who did business with whom? Who used whom? Which private operations were actually entangled with domestic and foreign intelligence? And how to dismantle the thing from within. To the men who lived off secrecy, organized crime, the oldest Caribbean channels, the exile corridors, the compromised officials, Valachi was a floodlight. One committee hearing could bring down years of protected work. In that climate, the idea that something had to be done didn't need a formal meeting. It could form as a shared instinct across a network that already understood survival the same way. Remove the problem. If Oswald was a pawn, he was the perfect pawn. Visible enough to be tagged, unstable enough to be guided, insignificant enough to be sacrificed. A man who could be manipulated into believing he was a hero, Castro's killer, history's headline, without realizing he was being written into someone else's ending. There are allegations that during the Mexico period, Oswald met with David Atlee Phillips. Separately, there is Veciana's claim that his handler, Maurice Bishop, was not only real, but in contact with Oswald. Veciana described being summoned in late August or early September 1963 to meet Bishop in Dallas. The rendezvous was in a downtown skyscraper business building identified as the Southland Center, with a public area on the first floor. Veciana arrived early. Bishop wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a quiet, strange, preoccupied young man. The three walked to a cafeteria. The young man stayed 10 or 15 minutes until Bishop dismissed him with something like, "All right, see you later." After the assassination, when Oswald's face covered newspapers and television, Veciana said he recognized the young man as Oswald, no doubt in his mind. If it wasn't Oswald, Veciana said, it was his exact double. That matters because Oswald's movements in that period are thin. He was unusually invisible between August 21st and September 17th, making only one known appearance in New Orleans, Labor Day, September 2nd, when he reportedly visited Charles Murrett, an uncle with Mafia connections. Even small anomalies get noticed in a life like his. Library books returned at the end of that period were overdue, a rare lapse in a man known for meticulous library discipline. In a story dominated by missing records and substituted identities, even overdue books start to look like a shadow on the wall. In 1978, Veciana added a postscript that turned suspicion into motive. After the assassination, he said Bishop asked him to contact a cousin by marriage who worked in the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, Guillermo Ruiz. Bishop wanted Ruiz, for money, to make statements saying Lee Harvey Oswald had been at the embassy a few weeks before the assassination. Veciana asked if it was true. Bishop replied it didn't matter whether it was true. What mattered was that a Cuban diplomat confirmed it. Veciana says he couldn't immediately reach Ruiz, and before he could, Bishop told him to forget the whole thing and ask no questions. If that request happened, it wasn't intelligence work. It was narrative work. A separate thread runs through Dallas that year, the FBI's contact with the Oswalds after Mexico City. Agent James Hosty learned Oswald had spoken to the Soviets in Mexico City and discovered Marina was living in Irving with Ruth Payne, separated from her husband. The FBI visited under the standard explanation, checking on people from behind the Iron Curtain, asking about blackmail pressure on relatives back home, offering a point of contact. Later, Oswald took it personally. Around November 12th, he showed up at the FBI office in Dallas with a note to Hosty. "Stop bothering my wife, and if it happens again, he'd blow up the FBI or the Dallas police." Accounts vary in phrasing, but the intent was violent. After the assassination, Hosty claimed he didn't realize at the moment that the note was from Oswald, though a secretary who saw it said it was signed and clear. On November 22nd, 1963, while the public watched the motorcade turn, the machinery of the story snapped into motion. There's also John Martino. Martino was an associate of Santo Trafficante, a man whose specialty was gambling equipment. He'd worked Havana casinos in 1959, went back after Castro took over, apparently to help smuggle money out, got arrested, tried and sentenced, then secured release in 1962. He resettled in Florida and threw himself into anti-Castro activity. He published a book and toured to promote it, including stops in New Orleans and in early October 1963 in Dallas. According to his son Ed, the Martino household was glued to the news, Cronkite, Huntley-Brinkley, the nightly ritual. One evening a commentator mentioned Kennedy's forthcoming trip to Dallas, and Martino said flatly, "If he goes to Dallas, they're going to kill him." On the morning of November 22nd, Martino told his son Edward to stay home from school, keep his eye on the news, and report any developments, while Martino worked in the garage. When the shots hit and the broadcasts turned to chaos, Martino didn't panic. He went to the phone, and he started building the link. Oswald to Castro. That link appeared fast in early reporting. Oswald described as a former Fair Play for Cuba committee chairman in New Orleans. Debates with figures like Edward Butler, the image of the left-wing assassin. This is where the plot, if it existed, needed to be clean. Shoot the president, eliminate the fall guy, and let the Cuba file ignite the next act. Some narratives argue this is the part that went wrong. Oswald was supposed to have a rendezvous after the assassination at the Texas Theater, where he would be murdered and his body would disappear. Rumors would follow. A mysterious private plane flying from Texas into Mexico City. Blame rolling to Havana, triggering an invasion of Cuba. But Oswald wasn't eliminated. He was arrested, screaming and shouting in the Texas Theater. He was quoted as saying, "It's all over now." He denied everything. He demanded legal representation. He said he didn't shoot anybody. He insisted he was being railroaded because he worked in the building. Captain Will Fritz told the press the case was cinched. The narrative required certainty, and certainty arrived on schedule. Too fast, too neat. What's often forgotten is what Lyndon Johnson feared in those first hours. Johnson was reportedly concerned he could be forced into war by the assassination. Oswald's Mexico City contacts, the Cuban consulate, the Soviet embassy, were enough to set off alarm bells. Instead of leaning into a war scenario, Johnson formed the Warren Commission to reassure the public that the assassination was not part of a broader plot that could trigger global catastrophe. The commission became the containment vessel. Meanwhile, later claims about Martino darken the picture. There are allegations Martino confessed his role to at least 2 people, including a Newsday reporter named John Cummings. Cummings reportedly claimed Martino told him he helped put the assassination together, and that Oswald was supposed to meet another conspirator in the Texas Theater, where the plan was to eliminate him and make him disappear. True or not, it fits the logic of the operation. A story requires closure, and closure requires a dead narrator. Then, years later, the larger context got sharper. Anthony Summers' reporting and the material drawn from Conspiracy, Who Killed President Kennedy, put the 1963 pivot into a broader frame. Kennedy's move toward détente, the projected withdrawal from Vietnam, the conflict with gung-ho CYA opinion, the fury of extreme conservatives, and the exile world's sense of betrayal. The government clamped down on renegade exile raids. The diehards pushed back. Veciana said Bishop urged provocations specifically to sabotage Kennedy's policy, and Summers described the Mexico City episode as the most disturbing recent information, because it suggested a senior U.S. intelligence officer was in contact with Oswald and tried to fabricate evidence after the assassination. If a Kennedy-Castro rapprochement was taking shape in the fall of 1963, the implications weren't theoretical. The claim is that Kennedy was engaged in highly secret contacts with Castro, tentative steps toward accommodation, and that he ordered those initiatives kept secret from the State Department bureaucracy and the CIA. Ambassador William Atwood was to be briefed for a face-to-face meeting with Castro. Atwood and Arthur Schlesinger both believed the secret almost certainly leaked, possibly through careless phone lines. Atwood's view is blunt. If word of possible normalization leaked to extremist Cuban exiles and the more aggressive CIA people tied to Bay of Pigs-era operations, it could have impelled violent action, up to assassinating the president. Schlesinger shared the same grim speculation. After Dallas, Johnson aborted the secret Castro contacts and reversed Kennedy's Vietnam withdrawal direction. If the goal were to halt Kennedy's course, Cuba, détente, disengagement, the bullets achieved the required effect. History doesn't always change with a manifesto. Sometimes it changes with a timetable, and the Bishop thread refused to die. Assassinations Committee investigators built a description. Mid-60s at the time, about 6'2", athletic build, over 14 stone, grey-blue eyes, light brown hair, fair complexion, usually tanned, sunspots under the eyes, meticulous dresser, reading glasses by the early 70s. They issued an artist's impression and appealed nationwide for help identifying him. A former J.M. Wave officer, quoted as Ron Cross, said he was almost positive. Bishop was a cover name used by a headquarters officer who visited J.M. Wave, possibly a chess analogy, paired with another cover name, Knight. Cross suggested Knight might have been Howard Hunt, and Bishop might have been David Phillips, the CIA official serving in Mexico at the time of the Oswald visit and in charge of Cuban operations there. Phillips testified under oath in 1978, denied using the name Bishop, denied hearing it used by any CIA employee, and when shown the artist's impression said, "It looks like me." Investigators confronted Veciana with Phillips. Veciana had once been introduced to Phillips by name at a social occasion. Phillips showed no recognition. When Veciana was shown a photograph, his reaction wasn't absolutely conclusive. Veciana denied Phillips was Bishop. The committee suspected Veciana was lying. They also suspected Phillips because he claimed not to recognize Veciana, the founder of Alpha 66, despite years deeply involved in anti-Castro operations. The committee concluded there was no evidence Phillips took part in a conspiracy to murder the president. But they underlined what mattered. Veciana's allegation that a U.S. intelligence officer met Oswald shortly before the assassination, and later tried to incite a Cuban contact to fabricate a link between Oswald and Cuban diplomats. If true, it was not a footnote. It was an instruction manual for blame. And even the aftermath carried its own warning. Summers noted macabre events persisted as the Justice Department hesitated over a full reopening. Veciana, the key witness in the Bishop affair, narrowly escaped assassination in a later period when professional killers ambushed him on his way home from work, wounding him in the head. He survived. The search for Bishop continued. The story refused to lock into a single official shape because too many parts of it seemed built to be shaped in the first place. Oswald's path From the Soviet Union to Dallas, from New Orleans leaflets to Mexico City visas, from missing tapes to disputed photos. Reads like a man walking through rooms already prepared for him. Whether he understood it or not, his name became the instrument, a file name, a public villain, a trigger. And once the world heard Oswald, the network that had spent years chasing Castro suddenly had something else to chase, a way to make one killing do the work of 10, politically, operationally, historically, without leaving fingerprints that could survive daylight.